Hey guys! Tonight we're going to drift back in time. Not to the Wild West you think you know, the one with the noble gunslingers, the duels at high noon, and the lone rider silhouetted against a fiery sunset. You're picturing it now, aren't you? The dusty street, the tumbleweeds, the hero with a steely gaze and a suspiciously clean hat. We're going to that place, but we're going to peel back the Hollywood veneer to see the grit, the grime, and the grim reality underneath. And let's be honest, based on the real historical data, if you were dropped into the actual 1870s American West, you probably wouldn't survive the first week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a wide, sun-baked dirt road. The air is thick with the smell of dust, manure, and stale beer wafting from the saloon doors swinging lazily in the breeze. At one end of the street stands a man, his hand hovering over the pearl-handled revolver at his hip. At the other end, another man mirrors his stance. This is it, the moment of truth. The scene is so deeply etched into our collective imagination that it feels more real than history itself. It's the climax of 1,000 movies, the fantasy of rugged individualism played out in a deadly ballet. But let's pause the scene right there. Take a breath and really think about it. Does this make any sense? You're about to engage in a lethal conflict, and your chosen strategy is to stand in the open, 100 feet from your opponent, and hope your aim is better than his? In reality, if someone in the 19th century West wanted you gone, they wouldn't challenge you to a formal duel. They'd be more likely to wait until you were leaving that saloon, full of whiskey and confidence, and shoot you from a dark alley. Or from a rooftop. Or maybe just hit you over the head with a shovel. It's far more effective and, frankly, much safer. The classic high noon duel was almost entirely a fiction, a piece of choreography invented for the stage. The cowboy hero himself is the greatest fabrication. You picture a stoic, independent man who wanders the plains, righting wrongs and answering to no one. The reality? A cowboy, or cowpuncher, was essentially a migrant farmhand on horseback. The great cattle drives of the post-Civil War era, from roughly 1866 to the late 1880s, were the heart of the cowboy's world. And it wasn't a world of adventure. It was a world of grueling, monotonous labor. You'd be in the saddle for up to 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months on end. You'd be young, likely in your late teens or early 20s, and you'd be poorly paid, maybe $1 a day, if you were lucky. You weren't likely to be the square-jawed white hero of the movies, either. Historians estimate that at least a quarter of all cowboys were black, freed from slavery after the Civil War and seeking a life with more freedom than sharecropping offered. Another significant portion were Mexican vaqueros, from whom the American cowboys learned virtually everything, from the design of their saddles and the use of lariats to the very vocabulary of the trade, like lariat, rodeo, and even buckaroo, a corruption of vaquero. Your greatest enemies wouldn't be masked bandits or corrupt sheriffs. They would be thirst, stampedes, prairie fires, rattlesnakes, and disease. You'd spend your nights singing softly to the cattle, not because you were a wandering troubadour, but because the sound of a calm human voice was believed to soothe the nervous longhorns and prevent a catastrophic stampede that could kill you in an instant. Your iconic chaps weren't a fashion statement. They were thick leather armor to protect your legs from being shredded by thorny mesquite and cactus. It was a life of grit, not glamour. So why did we invent this grand, heroic lie? The answer lies in timing. The myth of the Wild West didn't truly explode in the American consciousness while the West was still wild. It was born just as the frontier was dying. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau made a startling announcement. For the first time in American history, there was no longer a discernible frontier line. The continent had been settled. The wilderness, which had defined the American experience for centuries, a place of escape, of reinvention, of endless possibility, was officially closed. This created a kind of national identity crisis. For generations, the West was the answer to everything. Unhappy with your life? Go west. Need a fresh start? Go west. The nation needed a new story to tell itself about its own character, and it found one by looking backward, through a thick, romantic haze. This is where the myth-makers step in. The most influential was William F. Buffalo Bill Cody. He was a real scout and buffalo hunter, but his true genius was in marketing. In 1883, he launched Buffalo Bill's Wild West, a massive outdoor spectacle that was part circus, part history play, and part blockbuster action film. It was the 19th century equivalent of a Marvel movie, touring the United States and Europe to sold-out crowds. It featured real-life figures like the sharpshooter Annie Oakley and, for a time, even the great Lakota leader Sitting Bull. But they weren't there to present history. They were there as characters in a drama Cody created. His show presented a simple, thrilling narrative. Heroic cowboys and soldiers triumphing over savage Indians and dastardly outlaws. It was a massive, thundering, gunpowder-scented lie, and people loved it. At the same time, you had the rise of the dime novel. These were cheap, mass-produced paperbacks that churned out hundreds of stories about fictional heroes like Deadwood Dick and real-life figures turned into superheroes, like Wild Bill Hickok. In these stories, one man could fend off 100 foes, shoot a pistol out of a man's hand from 50 yards, and always get the girl. The dialogue was cheesy, the plots were repetitive, but they sold in the millions, cementing the image of the West as a place of non-stop, violent adventure. A real gunfight of the era would probably have looked a lot less like a movie and more like two guys who'd never fired a pistol in anger missing each other repeatedly until one ran away. Even a figure like Theodore Roosevelt played a part. He was an Eastern aristocrat who went to the Dakota Territory to mourn his wife and mother and, in his own words, to build his body and spirit. He became a passionate advocate for the strenuous life, and he saw the West as the forge that created the ideal American: tough, self-reliant, and virtuous. His popular writings helped elevate the cowboy from a lowly laborer to a national folk hero. Historians still argue whether the myth of the West was a deliberate nationalist project to unify a diverse country after the Civil War, or simply a commercial phenomenon driven by entertainment. It was likely a bit of both. A nation grappling with industrialization, mass immigration, and the anxieties of modern urban life found comfort in a simple, powerful story about a time when men were men and the land was free. It was a beautiful story. But it was a story that required ignoring the much darker, more brutal truths of what it actually took to win the West. That romantic story of the heroic West, the one that brought comfort to a nation in flux, could only exist by being incredibly selective. It was a highlight reel that cut out the long, grim scenes of what westward expansion actually cost. To understand the foundation of the myth, you have to look past the lone cowboy on the horizon and see the vast landscape he was riding through, a landscape that was being fundamentally and violently remade. Before the settlers, before the railroads, before the cowboys, the Great Plains were not an empty wilderness waiting to be tamed. They were a thriving, complex ecosystem, a sea of grass that stretched from Canada to Mexico, and its heart was the American bison. You can't comprehend the scale. You're trying to picture a herd of buffalo, maybe a few hundred like you've seen in a nature documentary. But that's not it. You need to imagine millions. Tens of millions. An estimated 30 to 60 million bison roamed the continent. They were a force of nature, a dark, thundering river of life that could stretch for 50 miles. John James Audubon, the famous naturalist, described a herd that took 3 full days to pass his camp. The ground would shake as they moved. For the Plains tribes, the Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Comanche, and others, the buffalo, or Tatanka, was everything. It wasn't just an animal. It was the center of their universe. Imagine your life, but every single thing you need comes from one source. The bison was their grocery store, providing rich meat that was eaten fresh or preserved as jerky and pemmican, a high-energy food made of dried meat, fat, and berries that could last for years. It was their hardware store. Its bones were shaped into knives, arrowheads, and tools, while the tough sinew became bowstrings and thread. It was their department store, its hide providing warm robes for the brutal winters, moccasins for their feet, and the tough, waterproof covering for their tippis. Even the bison's dried dung, buffalo chips, was the primary fuel for fires on the vast, treeless plains. The bison was their economy, their culture, and their church, woven into their creation stories and sacred ceremonies. To destroy the bison was to destroy their world. And that's exactly what happened. The Great Slaughter began in earnest after the Civil War. It was driven by a perfect storm of industrial greed and military strategy. In the East, tanneries had perfected a method for turning bison hides into the soft, durable leather needed for the belts that powered the machines of the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, a buffalo hide that was once worth very little was worth a few dollars, a fortune at the time. This sparked a rush. A new kind of hunter descended on the plains, not to feed his family, but to kill for profit. The newly built transcontinental railroad was the critical artery for this slaughter. It sliced the great herd in two and provided an efficient way to transport the hides back east. The railroads brought in armies of hide hunters, who could kill hundreds of animals a day with their powerful, long-range rifles, like the .50 caliber Sharps. It takes a real marksman to hit something the size of a small car from a moving vehicle when there are literally millions of them covering the entire landscape. The trains also promoted hunting excursions, where passengers would fire from the windows of their rail cars, killing for sport and leaving the massive bodies to rot on the prairie. But behind the commercial frenzy was a colder, more deliberate purpose. The United States military had been fighting a series of brutal wars against the Plains tribes for decades. They had learned that the Plains warriors were among the most skilled light cavalry in the world. On their own turf, they were incredibly difficult to defeat. But U.S. commanders, men like William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan, understood the Indians' total reliance on the bison. They realized that killing the buffalo was a more effective weapon than any soldier's bullet. It was a campaign of ecological warfare. The official policy is a point of some contention. Historians still argue about the degree to which the bison extermination was an explicit, top-down government policy versus a commercial enterprise that the military simply encouraged and exploited. But the sentiment was clear. When a bill was introduced in Congress in 1874 to protect the dwindling herds, it was President Ulysses S. Grant who quietly pocketed it, and the military that argued against it. General Sheridan was said to have told the Texas legislature that hide hunters were doing more to settle the Indian question than the Army had in 30 years. And that they should be given a medal with a dead buffalo on one side and a discouraged Indian on the other. The result was an annihilation on a scale that is difficult to process. In just over a decade, the bison was pushed to the brink of extinction. From an estimated 30 million or more in 1860, the population crashed to fewer than 1,000 by 1884. Imagine the plains, once teeming with life, now a vast, silent boneyard. The air for hundreds of miles was thick with the stench of millions of rotting carcasses, stripped of their valuable skin and left behind. The aftermath was so vast that it created a new, macabre industry, bone picking. Crews of men, often the same hide hunters who had killed the animals, went back out onto the plains to collect the skeletons. The bones were piled into colossal mounds beside the railroad tracks, then shipped east to be ground into fertilizer or used as carbon to refine sugar. It was perhaps the grimmest recycling program in American history, turning the skeletons of a civilization's foundation into industrial powder. Some say the stink of the skids, the origin of the term, skid row, came from the rancid smell of these massive piles of hides waiting on railroad platforms. For the native peoples, it was an apocalypse. Their world ended not with a bang, but with a horrifying, deafening silence on the plains. Starvation became a constant threat. Their entire way of life, built on the sacred rhythm of the buffalo migration, collapsed. Their independence was shattered. With their primary source of food, shelter, and trade gone, they were left with a terrible choice: starve, or submit to the U.S. government and move onto reservations. There, they would become dependent on federal rations of beef and flour, which were often spoiled, insufficient, and used as a tool to control their behavior. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a cultural and spiritual cataclysm, a deliberate severing of the connection between a people and the land that sustained them. The heroic myth of the West was built atop these bones. The image of those plains littered with bones is a heavy one to sit with. It's stark and brutal, and it feels like the whole story. It's easy, when confronted with that horror, to swing the pendulum of opinion all the way to the other side, to see the entire saga of westward expansion as nothing more than a tale of villains and victims, a shameful history of greed and genocide. And that story is undeniably true. But it's not the only true story. The real challenge of looking at the past, the thing that asks the most of us, is to resist the comfort of a simple narrative. History is rarely a clean line between good and evil. More often, it's a tangled, messy knot of conflicting truths, and you have to be willing to see it all at once. You have to hold in your mind the story of the pioneer family. Imagine you are that family. You fled famine in Ireland, or political turmoil in Germany, or the crushing poverty of an East Coast factory town. You've sold everything you own for a wagon, a team of oxen, and a piece of paper that promises you 160 acres of land you've never seen. That land is your only hope. It's the single prayer you have for a future where your children won't starve. You then endure a journey so punishing it's hard for us to even imagine, a journey we'll walk through in more detail later. When you finally arrive, you find a vast, intimidating emptiness. The wind never stops. The summer sun is blistering, and the winter blizzards can bury your home and kill you in your sleep. There are no neighbors for miles. There is no doctor, no law, no one to help you but yourself. Your life is a battle against drought, against locusts that can eat your entire year's work in a single afternoon, against a loneliness so profound it can break your mind. To survive, to carve out a life from that unforgiving soil, required a kind of courage and resilience that is nothing short of heroic. It is a story of human endurance, of hope against all odds. Now, hold that picture in your mind. Don't let it go. And right next to it, place another. You are a member of a Lakota band. That empty land the settlers see is your home. It's your history book, your church, your grocery store. Every hill, every river bend has a name and a story. The wilderness is a landscape you know intimately, one your people have shaped for generations using controlled fires to manage the herds and cultivate useful plants. What the settlers called an untamed wilderness, you might call a well-maintained garden. Then one day, you see them. The wagons. At first a trickle, then a flood. They are plowing up the sacred earth, fencing off the hunting grounds your family has used for centuries, and driving away the bison that are the center of your universe. Their dream is a nightmare that is systematically dismantling your world. Their hope is your despair. Both of these stories are true. They happened at the same time, in the same place. The triumph and the tragedy are two sides of the same coin. The myth of the West that we inherited, the one from Buffalo Bill's shows and the dime novels, insisted that these two stories were part of a linear progression from savagery to civilization. This was the core justification for everything that happened. But it was based on a profound misunderstanding, or a deliberate misrepresentation, of Native American societies. The people of the plains were not the primitive, wandering savages of the American imagination. They had deeply complex and ordered societies. Their social structures were intricate webs of kinship and clan responsibilities. They had sophisticated systems of governance and diplomacy. In fact, many tribes used a highly developed, universal sign language, today called Plains Indian Sign Language, that allowed them to communicate complex ideas about trade, politics, and philosophy with other tribes that spoke entirely different languages. It was a silent, graceful lingua franca for an entire region. and many weren't purely nomadic. Along the great rivers, like the Missouri, tribes like the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara built large, permanent towns. Their homes were ingenious earth lodges, spacious, circular structures that were cool in the summer and warm in the winter, housing multiple families. They were expert farmers, cultivating massive fields of corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers, producing such surpluses that they were a major hub in a trade network that stretched for thousands of miles. When the explorers Lewis and Clark spent the winter with the Mandan in 1804, they weren't visiting a primitive camp. They were guests in a bustling, prosperous city of thousands of people, and they survived that winter largely because of the tribe's generosity and their abundant food stores. The fundamental conflict of the West wasn't really about savagery versus civilization. It was about two irreconcilable ideas about humanity's relationship with the land. For the European settlers, land was a commodity. It was property, an asset to be measured, divided, bought, sold, and owned by an individual. This concept was the bedrock of their law and their economy. For most native cultures, this idea was utterly alien. Land was a living entity, a sacred provider, a shared resource that belonged to no one and everyone, like the air you breathe or the water you drink. You can't own your mother. You can't sell the sky. It was the ultimate case of terms and conditions may apply. For one group, the contract was for a parcel of private property. For the other, it was like someone showing up and trying to sell you a deed to the ocean. This clash of worldviews made conflict almost inevitable, and it was fueled by the powerful idea of manifest destiny. Historians still argue whether manifest destiny was a genuine, popularly held belief that God had ordained American expansion, or if it was primarily political propaganda crafted by elites to justify territorial acquisition. Either way, it provided a moral and even divine permission slip for the expansion that displaced and destroyed other cultures. It allowed people to see the story of the pioneer as righteous and the story of the native as an unfortunate but necessary sacrifice to progress. To truly understand this history, you have to resist that simplification. You have to be able to feel the hope of the immigrant family building their sod house, and at the very same time, feel the grief of the Cheyenne family watching the last buffalo fall. History isn't a courtroom where you have to pick a side and declare one party guilty and the other innocent. It's more like a landscape, and your job is to see all of it, the sunlit peaks of human resilience and the dark, shadowed canyons of injustice. They are both part of the view. So you hold those two stories in your mind, the settler's triumph and the native's tragedy. You see the complexity, the knotted-up tangle of hope and devastation. And yet, which story do we tell ourselves most often? Which image springs to mind when someone says, the Old West? It's the cowboy, the lone hero, the myth. It's a ghost that still haunts the American house, a story that we haven't stopped telling, because it does something for us. The legacy of that invented frontier isn't just in old movies on a Sunday afternoon. It's woven into the very fabric of modern American identity, shaping how the nation sees itself and how its people see each other. The question is, why is this 150-year-old piece of fiction still so powerful? It's because the cowboy archetype speaks to a set of values that many Americans hold as fundamental. First and foremost is the idea of rugged individualism. This is the belief that you are the master of your own fate, that you can and should solve your own problems without help from anyone, especially the government. The mythical cowboy is the ultimate individualist. He needs no committee, no bureaucracy, no social safety net. He has his horse, his gun, and his own moral code. This ideal is incredibly appealing. It taps into a deep-seated desire for autonomy and self-reliance. It's a powerful story to tell yourself, whether you're facing a personal struggle or a national crisis. Then there's the intoxicating idea of freedom. The cowboy's freedom isn't just about voting or civil liberties. It's a more profound, almost elemental freedom. It's the freedom of the open range, the absence of walls, rules, and nagging neighbors. It's the freedom to simply ride away from anything that tries to tie you down. It's a fantasy of ultimate escape, a powerful antidote to the feeling of being trapped in the complex, regulated, and often frustrating modern world. You're not just buying a pickup truck named the F-150 Raptor. You're buying a piece of that fantasy, the ability to single-handedly haul a redwood tree out of a canyon while a bald eagle sheds a single, patriotic tear. The truck just comes with it. And finally, there's the seductive notion of natural justice. The most thrilling part of the Western myth is when the official law fails. The sheriff is corrupt, the mayor is a coward, the system is broken. So the hero has to step outside the law to enforce a higher law. This narrative of the good guy with a gun, who cleans up a town, resonates deeply with a long-standing American skepticism of authority. It suggests that true justice is something you make for yourself, and it has powerfully shaped contemporary debates around everything from law enforcement to gun ownership. You see this archetype everywhere in American politics. It's funny how many politicians who've spent their entire lives in boardrooms suddenly develop a deep love for denim and folksy sayings a few months before an election. The cowboy cosplay is a powerful force. They adopt the persona of the plain-speaking outsider who is riding into Washington, D.C., that den of corruption, to clean up the mess made by the fancy, out-of-touch city slickers. President Ronald Reagan, a former movie actor who literally played cowboys, was a master of this. He used his California ranch as a backdrop to project an image of authentic, common-sense leadership rooted in the simple virtues of the West. He wasn't just a president. He was the nation's sheriff. This legacy lives on in the very language of American life. The iconic cowboy hat, the Stetson, boss of the plains, has a history of its own. It wasn't invented by a grizzled frontiersman. It was designed in 1865 by John B. Stetson, a hatmaker from New Jersey. But its wide brim, high crown, and waterproof felt made it such a perfectly practical tool for the harsh Western climate that it was quickly adopted. It became the symbol not just of a person, but of an entire ethos. Even today, the myth sells. Blue jeans, originally the rugged uniform of miners and laborers, are now a global fashion staple that trades on an image of casual, American authenticity. The Marlboro Man, for decades, sold cigarettes not with flavor, but with an image of masculine freedom against a mountain backdrop. The DNA of the Western is embedded in our most popular modern stories. A space opera like Star Wars has all the classic elements. A dusty, backwater saloon on a desert planet. a cynical smuggler with a heart of gold. Han Solo is a classic cowboy outlaw, and a fight against a powerful, corrupt empire. A sci-fi show like Firefly is even more explicit. It's literally a western in space, complete with frontier towns, cattle rustling, and a crew of misfits just trying to stay free. The lone superhero who defies authority to do what's right is a direct descendant of the gunslinger. But there's a cost to being so in love with this particular ghost. The cowboy myth, for all its appeal, encourages simple answers to incredibly complex problems. The cowboy worldview is great if your biggest problem is a single villain who conveniently stands in the middle of the street for a duel. It's less helpful for figuring out global pandemics, economic inequality, or climate change. These are problems that can't be solved by one hero with a gun. They require cooperation, compromise, and collective action. All things the rugged individualist tends to view with suspicion. More than that, the myth, by its very nature, erases everyone else. It puts a white, male hero at the center of the story and pushes everyone else to the margins, turning them into sidekicks, victims, or villains. The West was one of the most diverse places in 19th century America. It was a landscape of native civilizations, of Mexican vaqueros, of black cowboys and soldiers, of Chinese railroad laborers, of women running ranches and businesses. But the myth flattens all of that rich, multi-ethnic reality into a whitewashed fable. This is why sociologists and historians still debate the extent to which American exceptionalism, the idea that the U.S. is unique among nations, is a product of this frontier myth. The myth suggested Americans were a new type of people, forged in the wilderness, free from the old, corrupt hierarchies of Europe. It's a compelling creation story, but it's one that requires you to ignore most of the characters. History isn't dead and gone. It's a living story we tell ourselves, and the story of the Wild West is one we're still telling, shaping who we are, for better and for worse. That living myth of the cowboy, for all its power, is a story about an individual. But the settling of the West was a story of groups, of families driven by a desperate hope. And their journey is a myth in itself. The iconic image of the prairie schooner, the white-bonneted wagon, sailing across a sea of grass toward a new life in a golden land. We picture families gathered around a cheerful campfire at night, singing songs under a canopy of brilliant stars, filled with a sense of adventure and purpose. This is another one of those beautiful, comforting lies. The reality of that journey was a grueling, 2,000-mile death march. You are there, in Independence, Missouri, in the spring of 1850. It's the jumping-off point, and the town is electric with a chaotic, nervous energy. It's a swirl of mud, mules, and money. You've sold your farm, everything you owned, to buy a wagon and a team of 4 skittish oxen that look at you with deep suspicion. The wagon is smaller than you imagined, a flimsy wooden box about 10 feet long and 4 feet wide. Into this, you must pack everything you need to survive for the next 6 months, and everything you'll need to start a new life on the other side of the continent: tools, seeds, clothing, bedding, and at least 1,000 pounds of food. The guidebooks being sold by fast-talking men on street corners promise a straightforward journey with plentiful water and grass. These guides, you'll later realize, seem to have been written by someone whose only experience of the West was looking at it from a very tall building in Philadelphia. Finally, your wagon train lurches into motion. The first few days are almost pleasant. The grass is green, the work is novel, and the sense of shared purpose is exhilarating. But the romance fades as quickly as the road turns to dust. You soon learn the first hard lesson of the trail. The wagon is not for you. It's for the supplies. You walk beside the lumbering oxen, through ankle-deep dust kicked up by hundreds of animals and wagons ahead of you. The dust is a living thing. It works its way into your clothes, your hair, your food, your lungs. You breathe it all day, and you cough it up all night. You walk 10 to 15 miles a day, every day, without fail, for what will feel like an eternity. Your world shrinks to the pace of an ox. Your life becomes a cycle of monotonous, back-breaking labor. You wake before the sun paints the sky, the air cold and damp. The men wrestle the stubborn oxen into their yokes. The women and older children hurry to build a fire, usually with dried buffalo dung, as wood is a distant memory. Breakfast is always the same: bacon, hardtack biscuits, and bitter coffee. It's the original high-sodium, low-enjoyment diet. Then, the call rings out, "Wagons, ho!" and the long, slow trudge begins again. At dusk, the routine reverses. You circle the wagons not so much for protection from attack, but to create a corral for the livestock. Another simple, repetitive meal. A few precious hours of exhaustion-drenched sleep, and then it begins again. There are no weekends. There are no holidays. Accidents are a constant, low-level hum of terror. A moment of inattention is all it takes. A child, drowsy from the endless walking, might try to climb onto the moving wagon for a rest, only to slip and fall under the massive, iron-rimmed wheels. This was a distressingly common way to die. A rifle, jostled in the back of a wagon, could discharge, maiming or killing someone nearby. River crossings were moments of pure dread. You watch as the wagon in front of you plunges into the rushing, muddy water of the Platte or the Snake River. The current catches it, the oxen panic, and in a heartbeat, a family's entire worldly possessions, and sometimes the family itself, are swept away. But the greatest killer on the trail, the enemy that haunted every wagon train, wasn't an accident or an ambush. It was disease. The trail was a perfect breeding ground for epidemics. Hundreds of people and their animals were moving along the same narrow corridor, using and contaminating the same water sources. And the great plague of the Oregon Trail was cholera. It would sweep through a wagon train like fire. You could be perfectly healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. It was a vicious, dehydrating illness that left its victims in agony. You watch your neighbor from the next wagon, a man you'd shared coffee with just yesterday, be buried in a shallow grave on the side of the trail. His wife and children must then get back in their wagon and keep moving. The train cannot stop. Grief is a luxury you cannot afford. The trail itself becomes a graveyard. It's estimated that up to 1 in 10 people who started the journey died along the way. That's a mortality rate of 10%. Over 2,000 miles, that's an average of 20 graves for every mile, though in reality they were clustered around difficult river crossings and contaminated springs. For long stretches, it was said there was a grave every 50 yards. Most were unmarked, dug quickly and shallowly, the ground tamped down to disguise the location from wolves. You walk past the discarded belongings of those who came before you. As the journey progresses and the animals weaken, people are forced to lighten their load. The trail is littered with heavy furniture, trunks of fine clothes, cast iron stoves, even pianos, left behind to rot on the prairie. Every abandoned heirloom is a monument to a broken dream. Historians still debate the true nature of interactions between the emigrants and Native Americans. The myth would have you believe it was constant warfare. But early on, violence was the rare exception. Interactions were far more likely to involve peaceful, and often vital, trade. But as the tide of settlers swelled, grazing lands were ruined and game was driven away, leading to increasing tension and conflict. Yet for you, on this journey, the much more immediate threat is the person coughing in the wagon behind you. You live with the constant, quiet fear that the next drink of water, the next meal, will be the one that carries death. This journey didn't forge heroes in the romantic sense. It forged survivors, people who had been stripped of everything but the sheer, stubborn will to take one more step. Those who survived the trail, the ones forged into something harder by the grief and the grit of the journey, arrived in a new land, but not necessarily a promised one. For many, the dream wasn't about 160 acres of soil. It was about the ground under the soil. It was the dream of gold. This was a different kind of hope, not the slow, patient hope of a farmer, but a frantic, feverish prayer for a miracle. The news from California in 1848 of gold being scooped out of a riverbed at Sutter's Mill sent a shockwave across the world. It was a siren song of instant wealth, and hundreds of thousands of men dropped everything to answer its call. You are one of them. You've left your family, your job, your entire world behind, convinced that you'll return in a year, a wealthy man. You arrive in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, and the scene is one of organized chaos. The riverbeds are choked with men, standing knee-deep in the frigid, snow-melt water, their backs bent in a permanent curve. This is placer mining, the first and supposedly easiest phase of the gold rush. You buy a pan, stake a small claim on a patch of riverbank that 1,000 men have already worked, and you begin. You scoop gravel and water into your pan, and you learn the specific, wrist-snapping motion needed to swirl it just right, washing away the lighter sand and mud, hoping, praying, that a few gleaming yellow flakes will be left at the bottom. You do this for 12, 14 hours a day. The cold water seeps into your bones, and your hands are raw and cracked. Your back screams in protest. At night, you collapse in a crude tent or lean-to, eat a miserable meal of beans and bacon that cost you 10 times what it should have, and listen to the sounds of drunken arguments and desperate coughing fits from the camps around you. The surest way to get rich in a gold rush, you quickly learn, wasn't to dig for gold. It was to be the person selling the shovels and the whiskey. That was the real gold mine. The iconic image of the lone prospector with his loyal mule is a romantic one, but after a year of this work, his main discoveries were usually just a bad back and a deep-seated hatred of beans. And the hard truth is, you're already too late. The easy gold, the stuff lying in the riverbeds, was mostly gone within the first couple of years. The real treasure wasn't in the water. It was locked deep inside veins of quartz, inside the solid rock of the mountains themselves. To get to it, you can't use a pan. You have to go to war with the mountain. You have to go underground. Now your dream takes a much darker turn. You take a job with one of the large mining companies that have moved in with the capital to fund these massive operations. Your workday begins by stepping into a creaking, open-air cage, which is then lowered hundreds, sometimes thousands, of feet into the blackness of the earth. You leave the sun and the sky behind and enter a different world. The station where you get off is a narrow, dripping tunnel, just tall enough to stand in. The only light comes from the single candle you have affixed to your hat with a lump of clay. Its weak, flickering flame casts huge, dancing shadows that make the rock walls seem to move. The air is the first thing that hits you. It's hot, damp, and dead, thick with the metallic smell of rock and the faint, acrid scent of blasting powder. This is your office. Your job is simple. Make big rocks into little rocks. You work in a team. Two of you hold a long steel drill bit against the rock face while a third man, the single jacker, hits the end of it with a sledgehammer over and over and over. You turn the drill a quarter turn after each blow. The sound is deafening in the enclosed space. You do this for hours, chipping away at the rock to create a hole a few feet deep. Then comes the most dangerous part. You carefully pack the hole with black powder or, even worse, the notoriously unstable early forms of nitroglycerin. You set a fuse, light it, and you run. You scramble through the dark, muddy tunnels, praying the fuse wasn't too short, and huddle behind a wall of rock as the explosion rips through the mine, shaking the very earth around you. Then you wait for the thick, choking dust to settle, and you go back in to shovel the shattered rock into ore carts. The dangers are your constant companions. The company's safety program consists of a single, unwritten rule: try not to die. A cave-in is the most terrifying possibility. The tunnels are shored up with heavy timbers, but there's no real engineering. The wood can rot in the damp air or crack under the immense pressure of the mountain. A sudden groan of timber is the only warning you might get before tons of rock entomb you in an instant. Then there's the air itself. You're breathing in pulverized rock dust all day long. It coats your lungs, slowly turning them to stone in a painful, incurable disease called silicosis, or miner's consumption. It's a guaranteed death sentence. It just takes a few years. Pockets of natural gas can be released by a pickaxe, leading to a fiery explosion, or the air can simply run out of oxygen, silently snuffing out your candle and then your life. The work was often done by immigrants, Cornishmen from England, who brought generations of hard rock mining experience with them, and Irish and Chinese laborers, who were often given the most dangerous jobs. These men were seen as expendable. The Cornish miners, at least, brought one small comfort from home: the pasty, a hearty meat and vegetable pie. Its thick, crimped crust was designed to be held by their dusty, arsenic-laced hands, so they could eat the filling without poisoning themselves and then discard the dirty edge. It was a small piece of practical genius in a world of brutal indifference. Historians debate the true economic impact of the gold rushes. While they certainly created fortunes and drove settlement, some argue they were a massive misallocation of human life and capital, a giant lottery that chewed up men and spat out a few winners, while the real, steady work of building a nation happened elsewhere, For you, in the candle-lit darkness of the mine, these debates mean nothing. All you know is the ringing in your ears, the ache in your back, and the dust in your lungs. The dream of gold that brought you here has become a daily gamble, not for riches, but for your own survival, deep beneath the sunny, golden hills of California. You descend from the hell of the mine shaft, blinking in the unfamiliar sunlight, your lungs thick with rock dust, your dream of gold replaced by the grim reality of wage labor. The stories of the West are so often stories of men. The cowboy, the prospector, the soldier, the outlaw. They are stories of action, of violence, of conquest. But these men made up only one part of the picture. What about the women? In the classic Western movie, you usually get two options. The saintly, virginal schoolmarm who arrives to bring culture to the heathens, or the sassy saloon girl with a hidden heart of gold. Hollywood pretty much forgot the main category. The woman who was too busy wrestling a pig out of her vegetable garden to do much fainting or canning. The reality of a woman's life on the frontier was a story of invisible, unending labor. Let's put you in her shoes. Your day begins in darkness, long before the sun rises. You move quietly so as not to wake your husband and the half-dozen children crammed into your tiny sod house or log cabin. The first task is the fire. You coax the embers in the wood-burning stove back to life, adding precious wood or dried buffalo chips. This stove is the center of your world. It is your only way to cook, but in the blistering summer, it turns your one-room home into a sweatbox. You begin breakfast, grinding coffee beans, mixing dough for biscuits, and frying salt pork. Once the men and children are fed and out the door, your real workday begins. The idea of housework doesn't even begin to cover it. You are not just a cook. You are a chemist, a manufacturer, and a logistician. You make your own soap, a dangerous process of rendering animal fat and mixing it with caustic lye that could burn your skin off. You make your own candles from tallow. You spend hours churning milk into butter. You are in a constant battle against dirt, sweeping the packed earth floor, fighting the dust that seeps in through every crack. Laundry isn't a chore. It's an all-day, muscle-shredding ordeal. You have to haul gallons of water from the creek, heat it over the fire, scrub the clothes on a washboard with harsh, homemade soap, rinse them, wring them out by hand, and hang them to dry, praying a dust storm doesn't undo all your work. It's a miracle anyone had any skin left. But your work isn't confined to the four walls of your house. You are also a farmer. You are solely responsible for the large vegetable garden, the critical source of nutrition that keeps your family from getting scurvy. You tend to the chickens, collect the eggs, and milk the cow. When it's time for planting or harvesting the main crops, you are out in the fields, working alongside your husband. And when he is away, on a cattle drive, hunting, or working for cash, you do it all. You are the one repairing the fence, tending the sick livestock, and protecting your home. You learn to use a rifle not for sport, but to chase a wolf away from your sheep or kill a rattlesnake coiled by the door. And then there is the burden of childbirth and motherhood. You will likely go through pregnancy and labor with no medical assistance beyond a female neighbor, if you're lucky enough to have one. You give birth in the same bed where you sleep, with no pain relief, fully aware that childbirth is one of the leading causes of death for women. The fear is immense. Then, you must raise your children in this dangerous environment, acting as their doctor when they are sick with fevers you don't understand, and as their teacher, trying to impart some basic literacy by candlelight after a 16-hour workday. For all of this back-breaking, life-creating labor, you have almost no legal identity. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, which was law in most of the country, your existence as an individual is suspended during your marriage. You are covered by your husband. You cannot own property in your own name. If you inherit money or land from your parents, it legally becomes his. You cannot sign a contract, and you cannot sue someone in court. A married woman was basically a legal ghost. Her husband owned her property, her wages, and probably the lint in her pockets. The phrase, "What's mine is yours," was a legally binding contract, but it only went one way. There was a strange and tragic paradox to this. For many women, the only path to legal and economic autonomy was widowhood. If your husband died, you could inherit the farm or the ranch. Suddenly, you were the head of the household in the eyes of the law. You could buy and sell property, manage your own finances, and make your own decisions. And countless women, faced with this devastating loss, rose to the occasion, successfully running large operations and proving they were more than capable. Historians debate whether the frontier was ultimately liberating or restricting for women. Some argue that the sheer necessity of their labor gave them more practical power and a more collaborative partnership within the family than their corseted, house-bound sisters in the East. Others argue that this was an illusion. Women were simply saddled with a double burden of farm and house labor in a much harsher world, while remaining legally invisible. Despite the hardships and the legal constraints, these women were the ones who built the social bedrock of the West. While men were often transient, chasing gold or cattle, women put down roots. They were the ones who pushed for the first schools. They organized church socials and picnics, creating the first threads of community in isolated places. They formed networks of mutual aid, a support system where women looked after each other, delivering babies, nursing the sick, and sharing food. This was the so-called civilizing of the West, and it was almost entirely the work of women. In the male-dominated boomtowns, some women found a unique path to independence by running boarding houses. Providing beds and meals to miners and travelers was a respectable and often highly profitable business a woman could run from her home, giving her an economic foothold in a world not designed for her. Their stories are not ones of high-drama duels, but of the quiet, fierce, and relentless courage of survival and creation. We've seen how the frontier demanded a crushing, often lethal, price from those who journeyed across it, and from the women who built its homes and communities with their invisible labor. Their stories complicate the myth of a heroic, adventurous West. But now we have to turn to the most cherished myth of all, the idea that the West was a land of equal opportunity, a great leveler where your past was washed away, and all that mattered was your grit and your willingness to work. It was the physical promise of the American dream, a clean slate. The idea that the West was a clean slate was true, but only if you were the one holding the chalk. For millions of people, this promise was a cruel fiction. The West didn't erase the prejudices of the nation. It often gave them a new, wilder, and more violent landscape in which to grow. The question was never just, is this the land of the free? It was freedom for whom? Let's start with the men who built the railroad that tied the country together. You've seen the iconic photograph from 1869 at Promontory Point, Utah. Two locomotives nose to nose, men in suits and top hats toasting with champagne. What you don't see in that famous picture are any of the roughly 15,000 Chinese laborers who did the most difficult and dangerous work. Lured from a homeland suffering from famine and political turmoil by the promise of Gold Mountain, they became the backbone of the Central Pacific Railroad, tasked with conquering the granite wall of the Sierra Nevada. They were paid less than white workers, had to provide their own food and shelter, and were given the most life-threatening jobs, like being lowered down sheer cliff faces in wicker baskets to chip away at the rock and plant volatile nitroglycerin charges. They were celebrated as marvels of efficiency and hard work while the railroad was being built. But as soon as the last spike was driven and the goldfields began to dwindle, the mood curdled. White workers, competing for scarce jobs, turned on them with a vengeance. A vicious tide of racism swept through the West. The Chinese were stereotyped as a yellow peril, carriers of disease and vice who were stealing jobs from hard-working Americans. This wasn't just mob sentiment. It was written into law. Towns and states passed discriminatory taxes and ordinances specifically targeting them. This culminated in a shameful piece of federal legislation, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. For the first time, the United States banned immigration based entirely on race and nationality. It was followed by horrifying outbreaks of violence, like the Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming in 1885, where a mob of white miners killed at least 28 Chinese workers, wounded many more, and burned their settlement to the ground. Now, consider the experience of the Mexican people for whom the West was already home. The American West wasn't an empty land. Much of it, including California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, was Mexican territory until 1848. The treaty that ended the Mexican-American War promised that the Mexican citizens who remained, the Californios, the Tejanos, would have their property rights, their culture, and their language respected. This promise was broken almost immediately. Anglo settlers, armed with a different legal system and a sense of racial superiority, descended on these lands. The process of proving you owned your ancestral ranch to a U.S. court was a nightmare. It was like trying to prove you own your house using a grocery receipt written in another language, while the judge and jury have already moved into your living room. Land grants that had been honored for generations were tied up in court for years, costing families their fortunes in legal fees, before often being declared invalid on a technicality. Through legal fraud, discriminatory taxes, and outright violence, thousands of Mexican families were stripped of their land and became impoverished laborers in what was once their own country. For African Americans, the West represented a different kind of hope. After the Civil War, escaping the terror and oppression of the Jim Crow South was a powerful lure. The West seemed to promise a real freedom, a chance to own land and live with dignity. Thousands came. They were the black cowboys we've talked about, making up a huge portion of the cattle drive workforce. They were the famed Buffalo Soldiers, segregated regiments of the U.S. Army that served with distinction all over the frontier. And they were homesteaders, founding all-black towns like Nicodemus, Kansas, as havens from the racism they sought to escape. But while the West offered more opportunity than the South, it was no paradise of equality. Black settlers still faced discrimination and segregation. They were often sold the worst, least fertile land. White-owned banks would deny them loans, and they were excluded from the social and political life of their white neighbors. Historians debate the legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers. They are rightly celebrated as heroes who demonstrated immense courage and patriotism in a country that refused to see them as full citizens. But there is a painful irony in their story. They were soldiers in a federal army that was actively dispossessing Native Americans of their land. It was a tragic case of the government using one oppressed minority to fight another. So you see, a clear, if unwritten, racial hierarchy governed the land of opportunity. At the top were white, Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Below them were other European immigrants, who could, over time, assimilate. Below them were the Mexicans, who were being systematically dispossessed. And at the bottom were the Native Americans, who were being confined and erased, and the Chinese, who were being violently excluded. The West wasn't a melting pot. It was more like a very rigid, socially distanced potluck where one group got to eat at the main table and everyone else was told to set up a folding chair in the yard, if they were invited at all. The dream of a fresh start was real, but it was a dream racially restricted from the very beginning. So, the clean slate of the West was already written on with the indelible ink of prejudice. But what if you fit the narrow profile for whom the dream was intended? What if you were a white family from the East, seeking not gold, but soil? For you, the promise was even more profound than a lucky strike. It was the promise of the Homestead Act of 1862, one of the most revolutionary pieces of legislation in American history. The government was offering you 160 acres of land, your own piece of America, for little more than a filing fee and a promise to live on it and work it for 5 years. It was a dream of deep, democratic appeal, a nation of independent, self-sufficient farmers. The yeoman ideal. You arrive in Nebraska, or Kansas, or the Dakota Territory, clutching that precious piece of paper. You stand on a small rise and look out at your 160 acres. And the first, quiet, sinking feeling begins to set in. This is not the green, rolling, tree-covered landscape you left behind in Ohio. This is the Great Plains. The land is flat, stretching to the horizon in every direction, and there are no trees. None. The sky is immense, and the wind never, ever stops. Early explorers had a name for this region, the Great American Desert. The promotional posters back east had conveniently left that part out. Your first problem is shelter. How do you build a house without wood? You build it out of the only material available in limitless supply, the ground itself. You build a sod house, or a soddy. You take a special plow and cut long strips of the prairie turf, dense with the tangled roots of buffalo grass. These strips are then sliced into bricks, each one weighing 50 pounds or more. You stack them, layer by layer, grass side down, to build the walls of your new home. For the roof, you lay a few precious pieces of timber, if you can afford them, and cover them with more sod. Your new house, from the outside, looks like little more than a lump of earth. And in some ways, it's an ingenious piece of engineering. The thick walls, 2 or 3 feet deep, keep you remarkably cool during the blistering summers and warm during the brutal winters. But it is also, essentially, a cave. The floor is packed earth. The walls are damp and smell of dirt. The only light comes from 1 or 2 small windows. And your sod house comes with roommates you didn't ask for. It's a living ecosystem. Mice and snakes make their homes in the thick walls. Insects, centipedes, and spiders are your constant companions. It's not uncommon for a rainstorm to wash mud down onto your dinner table, or for a startled garter snake to drop from the ceiling into your bed. Once you have your shelter, you have to tame the land. And this land does not want to be tamed. The same thick sod that built your house fights your plow every step of the way. If you manage to break the soil and plant a crop, you face an onslaught of environmental challenges that feel biblical in scope. The summers bring droughts that can last for weeks, the sun baking your fields until the young plants wither and turn to dust. The winters bring blizzards that roar across the flat landscape with no warning, burying your home in massive drifts of snow and bringing a cold so lethal it could kill any exposed livestock or person in minutes. And then there were the grasshoppers. A dark cloud would appear on the horizon, growing larger and larger until it filled the sky, accompanied by a sound like a roaring freight train. It was a swarm of billions upon billions of Rocky Mountain locusts. They would descend upon your farm and devour everything. They ate the cornstalks down to the nub. They ate the vegetables in the garden. They ate the wool off the backs of your sheep. They ate the laundry hanging on the line. They ate the leather harnesses of your tools and the wooden handles of your axes. In a few terrifying hours, an entire year's worth of back-breaking labor could be completely erased. Even if you survived all of that, the bugs, the blizzards, the drought, and you managed to harvest a crop of wheat, your struggle for survival wasn't over. In fact, it was just entering a new phase, the economic one. You had to sell your grain, and that meant getting it to the markets back east. There was only one way to do that, the railroad. The very same railroad that brought you west now had you in a stranglehold. You had to haul your grain to the nearest town, where the only place to store it was a grain elevator owned by the railroad company. You were charged whatever they wanted for storage. Then, you were charged whatever they wanted for shipping. You were at the mercy of their monopolistic rates. The promise was that you would be your own boss. The reality was that you had several bosses you just never met, the railroad tycoon in New York and the banker in Chicago. You were trapped in a cycle of debt. You borrowed money to buy your seed and your plow. You borrowed money to survive the first lean years. The interest rates were punishing. If you had one bad harvest, you couldn't make your payments. You'd have to take out another loan, at an even higher rate, just to stay afloat. Soon, you were farming not for yourself, but for the bank. The dream of the independent yeoman farmer was, for many, a cruel illusion. You were a serf, not to a feudal lord, but to a vast, impersonal industrial system of banks and railroads that was ruthlessly efficient at extracting wealth from your labor. The failure rate was enormous. For every family that proved up their claim after 5 years, at least one other gave up, broke and beaten, their homestead swallowed by the bank or a bigger landowner. The dream of owning a piece of America had, for them, become a nightmare of losing it. This feeling of being trapped, of being utterly on your own against forces you couldn't control, wasn't just economic. It extended to the most intimate and frightening parts of life and death. When your farm was failing, there was no government bailout. When a blizzard hit, there was no emergency service. And when your child spiked a fever in the middle of the night, there was no doctor. There was no 911 to call, no clinic to drive to. There was only you, the vast, silent prairie, and a terror so profound it's hard for us, in our modern world, to fully grasp. You have to erase your entire concept of healthcare. The nearest town is a day's ride away, and even if you could get there, it's unlikely to have a formally trained physician. The person called doc might just be the barber, who has some experience pulling teeth and setting bones. For most families, the primary caregiver was the mother. Your medical cabinet wasn't filled with antiseptics and antibiotics. It held a collection of herbal remedies, recipes passed down through generations, and a few terrifying patent medicines purchased from a traveling salesman. That bottle of Dr. Abernathy's restorative tonic that promised to cure everything from consumption to baldness? Its main ingredients were usually alcohol and laudanum, a potent opium tincture, with a little molasses for flavor. It didn't cure you, but it would certainly make you forget you were sick for a while. The most dangerous thing about 19th century medicine wasn't just the lack of effective treatments. It was the complete lack of understanding of what caused disease in the first place. For most of the century, the concept of germ theory, the idea that invisible microbes cause illness, was considered fringe science, lunatic ravings. Sickness was believed to be caused by a miasma, or bad air, or an imbalance in the body's four humors. This meant that basic sanitation was a foreign concept. A person might help birth a calf, then, without washing their hands, go assist in the delivery of a human baby. Instruments weren't sterilized. Water was drawn from sources often contaminated by human and animal waste. The frontier wasn't just a world without doctors, it was a world without knowledge. Nowhere was this vulnerability more apparent than in childbirth. Imagine you are that young woman we met, living in your sod house, and you are going into labor. There is no epidural. There is no pain relief of any kind. Your only assistance is your terrified husband and perhaps a neighbor woman who has done this a few times herself. You endure hours of agony on a bed of straw or old quilts, gripping a rope tied to the rafters. And you are praying. You are praying that nothing goes wrong. Because if it does, if the baby is in the wrong position, if there's a hemorrhage, there is nothing anyone can do. It is a death sentence for you, your child, or both. The statistics are sickening. The maternal mortality rate on the frontier was around 1,000 deaths per 100,000 births. Today, in the developed world, that number is less than 10. You were more than 100 times more likely to die in childbirth than a woman is today. Every single pregnancy was a life-threatening event. And even if you survived the delivery, the danger wasn't over. In the days that followed, you were at high risk of developing childbed fever, a raging infection of the uterus caused by the unsanitary conditions of the birth. It was common, agonizing, and almost always fatal. It's a strange thing to consider, but you might have been better off relying on the local Native American healer. Medical historians debate the effectiveness of tribal medicine versus the heroic medicine of the settlers, which often involved bleeding patients or giving them mercury to induce violent purging. The diagnostic process was pretty straightforward. You had either too much blood or not enough. Either way, things were about to get messy. In contrast, many native remedies, based on an intimate knowledge of local plants, like using willow bark, which contains the active ingredient in aspirin, were genuinely effective and far less likely to do active harm. Everyday accidents carried the threat of death. A simple, deep cut from an axe while chopping wood could be a fatal wound. You'd stitch it up yourself with a regular sewing needle and thread, but infection was almost guaranteed. If the wound became gangrenous, the only option was amputation. This would happen on your kitchen table, with a saw, a few leather straps to hold you down, and a bottle of whiskey for a crude anesthetic. Your chances of surviving the procedure, or the infection that followed, were slim. Common childhood diseases, which we now prevent with simple vaccines, were terrifying reapers. Outbreaks of measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, or whooping cough would sweep through a frontier community, and there was nothing to do but watch and pray. A mother might lose 3 of her 5 children in a single winter. You would have to watch your own child, burning with fever, struggle for breath, and know there was absolutely nothing you could do to save them. This constant proximity to death, this utter helplessness in the face of sickness and injury, was one of the heaviest and least talked about burdens of frontier life. It shaped the people who survived, leaving them with a hardness and a fatalism that is difficult for us to imagine. That feeling of utter vulnerability, of being the sole guardian of your family's health against a world of disease and injury, was a heavy weight to bear. It was a product of isolation. But what happened when you had to leave that isolated homestead? What was it like to actually move around in this vast, untamed country? The myth gives us a clear picture. The lone rider, moving with ease across the plains, free as the wind. He arrives in town, hitches his horse, and has everything he needs. But like all the other myths, this one crumbles under the weight of reality. Travel in the Old West wasn't a romantic adventure. It was slow, costly, deeply uncomfortable, and lethally dangerous. First, let's talk about the cost. Nothing was free. A good, sturdy horse was a massive investment, the 19th century equivalent of buying a reliable car. And that car needed constant, expensive maintenance. You had to pay for feed, for new horseshoes, for care if it went lame. Losing your horse, to a fall, a snake bite, or more likely, to a thief, was a disaster that could leave you stranded, miles from anywhere, facing a death sentence from exposure or thirst. If you opted for the luxury of a stagecoach, you paid dearly for it. A ticket could cost hundreds of dollars, a fortune at the time. And what you got for your money was the privilege of being crammed into a cramped, unpadded wooden box with up to 8 other passengers. For days on end, you would be violently jolted and thrown about as the coach bounced over rutted trails, thick dust pouring in through the leather flaps that served as windows. It was less a mode of transport and more a prolonged, full-body assault. When you finally reached a settlement for the night, the costs continued. A 5-star hotel on the frontier was one where the fleas on the mattress were at least polite enough to wait until you fell asleep before they started feeding. You might pay $1, a full day's wages for a cowboy, to share a single, filthy room with a dozen snoring, smelly strangers. You'd be lucky to get a mattress on the floor. Often it was just a patch of floor space. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. Then there was the food. Forget the thick steak and whiskey from the movies. The diet on the road was a monotonous, repetitive assault on your senses. It was built around three things that wouldn't spoil: beans, bacon, and hardtack. The bacon wasn't the crisp, lean kind we know. It was salt pork, mostly fat, preserved in brine. The hardtack was a simple, unleavened biscuit, baked until it was so hard it was nicknamed tooth duller, or sheet iron cracker. You'd have to soak it in coffee just to make it chewable. For weeks on end, this was your menu. The frontier diet was based on the three main food groups: brown, beige, and greasy. A fresh vegetable was a rare and treasured luxury, something you might only see once every few hundred miles. Beyond the cost and discomfort, there was the constant, simmering danger. While the dramatic, masked bandit holdup was a real threat on certain stagecoach lines, the more common danger was less cinematic. The person you had to worry about most was the friendly stranger you shared a campfire with, who might wait until you were asleep to steal your horse and your wallet. Human predators thrived in the isolation. You were an easy target, and there was no law to appeal to. But the most relentless threat wasn't human. It was the land itself. The West was a landscape that was actively trying to kill you. It was incredibly easy to get lost. Maps were often inaccurate or non-existent. You navigated by landmarks, the sun, and your own dwindling sense of hope. A single wrong turn could lead you into a waterless stretch of desert or a box canyon from which there was no escape. The weather could turn on you in an instant. A beautiful sunny day on the plains could transform into a blinding blizzard. A dry desert wash, or arroyo, could become a raging torrent of water from a thunderstorm miles away, sweeping you and your horse away without warning. And the wildlife wasn't just picturesque. Rattlesnakes were a constant and deadly threat. You learned to check your boots before putting them on, to be careful where you gathered firewood. A bite, far from any medical help, was almost certainly fatal. Encounters with bears, wolves, or mountain lions were a real possibility, especially if you were traveling alone at dusk or dawn. For all the action in the westerns, the overwhelming reality of frontier travel was boredom. Endless, mind-numbing boredom. Imagine days upon days of seeing nothing but the same flat, brown landscape, the same immense, empty sky. Your entire world is the rhythm of your horse's plodding walk, the creak of saddle leather, and the oppressive silence. The famous journey of Lewis and Clark is remembered as a great adventure, but if you read their journals, you find that much of it was consumed by the misery of infected insect bites, gnawing hunger, and the sheer monotony of paddling against a current day after day. Historians who have analyzed records from the era debate the true level of violence in the West. While certain boomtowns were undeniably violent places, the idea of constant, pervasive gunfights is largely a myth. For the average person, the risk of dying from dysentery, a lightning strike, or simple dehydration was vastly higher than the risk of being shot in a duel. The real adventure wasn't in fighting outlaws. It was in the simple, brutal, and uncertain struggle to survive the journey itself. After weeks of monotonous food, sleeping on the hard ground, and constantly watching your back, you see it on the horizon. A town. A cluster of wooden buildings that promises a hot meal, a real bed, and the safety of civilization. Your shoulders, tense for weeks, finally begin to relax. You've made it out of the dangerous, lonely wilderness and back to the world of people. But as you ride closer, the first sign that something is wrong hits you. It's the smell. It's a thick, complex wave of odors. The sharp tang of manure from the livery stable, the sour stench of dozens of outdoor privies, the rot of garbage, and the faint, musky scent of unwashed humanity. You realize, with a sinking feeling, that you haven't escaped the danger. You've just ridden into a different kind of hazard. The frontier town of your imagination, a clean, dusty street with a few handsome storefronts, is a Hollywood fantasy. The real thing is an assault on the senses. The main street, if you can call it that, is a quagmire. In the rainy season, it's a knee-deep swamp of mud, water, and animal waste. In the dry season, the slightest breeze kicks up a choking cloud of fine dust composed of pulverized dirt and dried manure. There are no sewers. There is no garbage collection. When you finish a meal, you throw the scraps out the door. When you empty a chamber pot, you toss it into the street. The town's sanitation department consists of a few hungry pigs and a flock of buzzards. It wasn't the most efficient system, but the employee morale was, presumably, quite high. You think you're thirsty after your long journey. You head to the town well or pump to get some fresh, clean water. But where is that well located? It's often in the center of town, just a few dozen yards from the livery stable's manure pile and the town's collection of outhouses. No one understands that the waste from those privies is seeping down through the soil and directly into the groundwater. They don't understand that the friendly town well is actually a pump that serves up a refreshing drink of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. The town isn't a refuge from the diseases of the trail. It's a factory for them, concentrating 100 people's waste into a single, shared water source. And then there are the flies. With open garbage and animal waste everywhere, the towns are swarming with biblical plagues of them. They are a constant, buzzing black cloud on everything. You see them crawling on the meat hanging in the butcher's shop, on the free lunch laid out on the bar of the saloon, and on the face of the sleeping baby in a nearby wagon. Since no one understands how germs are transmitted, they don't make the connection. That fly that was just enjoying a meal on a pile of horse manure is now walking across your slice of bread. The free lunch at the saloon was a generous offer, as long as you didn't mind sharing it with every fly in the county and whatever bacteria they'd been socializing with that afternoon. This complete lack of sanitation made frontier towns perfect incubators for epidemics. All it took was one sick person to arrive on the stagecoach. Within days, the local water supply would be contaminated and the disease would rip through the population. Entire towns could be decimated in a matter of weeks. The local graveyard, often called Boot Hill, was frequently the fastest growing part of any new settlement. In a grim irony, the isolated homesteader living in their damp soddy but drinking from their own private well was often at a lower risk of contracting these waterborne illnesses than the civilized person living in the crowded, filthy boomtown. Even the iconic saloon, the center of social life in the myth, was a public health nightmare. You push through the swinging doors into a room thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of stale beer and sweat. The floor is covered in a layer of sawdust meant to absorb mud, spit from the ubiquitous chewing tobacco, and anything else that might fall on it. The bartender serves you a shot of whiskey in a glass that he cleans by swishing it in a bucket of murky water that hasn't been changed all day. You're sharing that glass, and whatever germs came with it, with every other customer. Urban historians debate when, and if, these chaotic boomtowns ever truly became stable communities. Some were always meant to be temporary, places for rapid resource extraction that were abandoned as soon as the mine ran dry or the cattle trail shifted, destined to become the ghost towns we see today. But others show a surprising and immediate drive toward permanence. Even amidst the filth, people were starting newspapers, building churches that doubled as schools, and forming committees to create some semblance of order. But that order was a constant, uphill battle against the fundamental reality of their environment. The streets weren't just dirty, they were deadly. And the civilization these towns represented was, in many ways, just a more concentrated and efficient version of the dangers you thought you had left behind in the wilderness. So you've arrived in this filthy, disease-ridden town, a place far more dangerous to your health than the wilderness you just left. And it's not just the threat of sickness. The air is thick with tension. In the saloons, young men, filled with cheap whiskey and the frustrations of a hard life, eye each other with suspicion. Arguments flare up over card games. The potential for violence hums just beneath the surface. In a place this chaotic, what did law and order actually look like? The myth gives us one of its most powerful and enduring heroes, the lawman. You picture him now, the town marshal, a man of quiet integrity and lightning-fast reflexes. He's the thin white line between civilization and anarchy, a noble figure who brings justice to a lawless land. This is a wonderful story. It has almost nothing to do with the truth. The reality of being a frontier lawman, a town marshal, a county sheriff, was that it was a miserable, low-paying, high-risk job. Being a frontier marshal was 90% chasing stray pigs out of the general store and 10% sheer terror. The job description should have just said, "Must be good with a broom and willing to die for $40 a month." It didn't attract the noble heroes of fiction. It attracted drifters, former soldiers, and sometimes former outlaws who figured a steady, if dangerous, paycheck was better than nothing. Some were decent men trying to do a thankless job. Many were corrupt, in the pocket of the saloon owners or a powerful cattle baron who ran the town. Their primary duties weren't squaring off against black-hatted villains at high noon. They were dealing with the messy reality of the towns we've just described. They spent their days breaking up drunken brawls, dealing with domestic disputes, and trying to collect taxes from people who had no interest in paying them. A town marshal was often the only law for 100 miles in any direction. He had no backup, no forensics lab, and very little authority beyond what he could enforce with his own presence and his six-shooter. Facing down a dozen cowboys, fresh off a 3-month cattle drive with a pocket full of pay and a thirst for trouble, was often a suicide mission. Many lawmen learned that the wisest course of action was to simply go have a cup of coffee and wait for the trouble to burn itself out. And that iconic duel in the middle of the street? It almost never happened. As we've discussed, it's a terrible way to win a fight. Real violence in the West was ugly, clumsy, and cowardly. It was a shot in the back from a dark alley. It was a knife in a crowded bar. It was a drunken argument that ended with two men wildly emptying their pistols at each other from 10 feet away and, more often than not, missing. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, is held up as the classic example of a Western shootout. But it wasn't a duel. It was a chaotic, 30-second-long close-quarters gun battle between the Earp faction and the Clanton-McLaury faction. To this day, historians furiously debate who shot first and whether it was a legitimate act of law enforcement or a political hit. It was messy, ambiguous, and brutal, just like real frontier violence. When the official law was so weak and unreliable, people often decided to create their own. This is where the real law of the West emerged: mob justice. If a man was accused of a serious crime, especially horse theft, which was often a capital offense because it could leave a person stranded to die, a mob could form with terrifying speed. These vigilance committees, often made up of the town's most respectable businessmen, would decide the official legal process was too slow or uncertain. They would become the judge, jury, and executioner. The court of public opinion was the only one that really mattered, and it tended to reach a verdict very, very quickly, usually with the help of a sturdy piece of rope and a tall tree. The appeals process was limited. The accused would be dragged from the flimsy town jail or from his boarding house room and hauled away. There was no trial, no witness testimony, no chance for a defense. An accusation was as good as a conviction. The mob, fueled by whiskey and self-righteous anger, would hang the person from the nearest suitable object. This wasn't justice. It was hysteria, a way to vent the anxieties and fears of frontier life onto a convenient scapegoat. And it was deeply tied to race and prejudice. The victims of lynch mobs were disproportionately Mexican, Native American, or Chinese, often accused on the flimsiest of evidence because they were seen as outsiders. The term lynch law itself has murky origins, likely dating back to the American Revolution and a man named Charles Lynch who ran informal courts to punish British loyalists. But it became the defining term for this brand of frontier justice. Even when a case did make it to a formal court, the scene was hardly what we'd recognize. The courthouse was often just a rented room in the saloon. The judge was a traveling circuit rider who came through town maybe twice a year. The jury was pulled from the same population that might have formed the lynch mob the week before, and they were easily swayed by intimidation and public opinion. Historians debate the legacy of Western vigilantism. Was it a necessary, if brutal, step toward establishing order in a lawless land? Or was it fundamentally a form of terrorism, where powerful groups used the excuse of law and order to enforce their social and economic dominance over the poor and the marginalized? The truth is likely somewhere in the messy middle. But it was a far cry from the noble myth of the lone sheriff, standing courageously for a justice that was fair and blind. In the real West, justice wasn't blind. It was angry, impatient, and it often carried a rope. We've talked about the grand tragedies and injustices, the systemic violence and the crushing economic forces that defined the real West. We've deconstructed the myths of the cowboy, the homesteader, and the lawman. But sometimes the most profound truths aren't found in the grand narrative. They're found in the smallest, most intimate moments. So, for a moment, let's forget the history lessons and just be there. I want you to feel what it was like to simply wake up. This is your first morning on the frontier. You don't wake up gently. You're jolted awake by a cold that has sunk deep into your bones. You're lying on a mattress stuffed with lumpy straw, or maybe just a pile of burlap sacks on a dirt floor. The first thing you feel is a dull, throbbing ache in your back and shoulders from 14 hours of hard labor yesterday. The second thing you feel is an itch. A furious, persistent itch. Your clothes and your bedding are teeming with life. Fleas, lice, maybe bedbugs, and they've spent the night feasting on you. You scratch at the dozens of tiny, irritating bites on your skin, but it gives you no relief. The first sound you hear isn't the gentle chirping of birds. It's a cough. A deep, wet, hacking cough from the man sleeping a few feet away from you in this crowded one-room cabin. It's a sound you hear every morning, the sound of lungs being slowly destroyed by rock dust, or tuberculosis, or simply a chronic bronchitis that will never heal in this damp, drafty environment. Your morning alarm clock is a chorus of coughing, a symphony of suffering that lets you know another glorious day of survival is about to begin. You hear the skittering of mice in the walls and the relentless whistling of the wind through the cracks in the sod or timber. You take a breath, and the air is heavy and foul. It's a cocktail of smells. The stale odor of too many unwashed bodies sleeping in one small space, the greasy smoke from last night's fire, the faint, sour smell of the chamber pot in the corner, and the underlying scent of damp earth and mildew. This is the air you will breathe all day. You open your eyes, but it's still mostly dark. A pale, gray light filters through a single small window pane, greasy with grime. You see the vague shapes of the people around you, huddled under thin, scratchy wool blankets. You see the dirt on the floor, the soot staining the walls, the general, pervasive layer of filth that covers every single surface. There is no beauty here. There is no romance. There is only grit and grime. It's time to get up. You don't have a wardrobe to choose from. You have one set of clothes. You pull on the same stiff, foul-smelling canvas trousers and flannel shirt you've been wearing for the past week. They are still damp with yesterday's sweat. Your wool socks are stiff and scratchy against your flea-bitten ankles. Now for your morning hygiene routine. You won't be taking a hot shower. You won't be taking any shower. You might pour a little water from a bucket, water you hauled yourself from the creek yesterday, into a basin and splash your face. The water is freezing cold. You don't brush your teeth. Maybe you rub them with a cloth and a bit of salt, but your gums are probably swollen and sore from the beginnings of scurvy. Your mouth tastes like a swamp. The most common dental treatment is a pair of pliers. There is no deodorant, no cologne, no soap that smells of lavender. The natural scent of humanity, pungent and unfiltered, is simply a fact of life. Breakfast is waiting. It's the same thing you had yesterday, and the same thing you will have tomorrow. A piece of greasy salt pork, fried in its own fat. A hard, dry biscuit that you have to soak in your bitter, black coffee just to be able to chew. You choke it down, not for pleasure, but for fuel. It's calories to get you through another day of back-breaking work. As you sit there, chewing your hardtack and feeling the familiar aches settle into your bones, you think about the day ahead. There is no weekend to look forward to. No vacation. No prospect of a comfortable retirement. The horizon of your future is an unbroken line of more of the same. More labor, more discomfort, more dirt, more danger. This is the bedrock reality of the life you have chosen, or the life that has been chosen for you. Social historians debate the psychological impact of this life. Did it forge resilient, stoic heroes? Or did it lead to widespread depression, alcoholism, and what was then called melancholia? The letters and diaries from the period are filled with evidence of both. This is it. This is the real Wild West. Not the gunfights. Not the cattle drives. Not the gold rush. It's this moment. The moment you force your sore, itching body out of a filthy bed in the cold and the dark to face another day of grinding, relentless, unromantic survival. The true heroism of the frontier wasn't found in a quick draw. It was found in the quiet, stubborn courage it took to simply get up in the morning. You wake up in the cold and the dark, to the sounds of coughing and the feeling of filth. You force down your grim breakfast and prepare to face another day of grinding, soul-crushing labor. You are sore, you are lonely, and you are surrounded by hardship and the constant, quiet threat of death. How could anyone endure this? How could a person, a family, a community survive not just for a week or a month, but for years, for a lifetime, in these conditions? They couldn't live on grit and hardtack alone. The human spirit needs more. It needs connection. It needs joy. And even in the harshest corners of the frontier, people found ways to create it. The myth of the West is built on the foundation of rugged individualism, the idea of the lone hero who needs no one. But the reality that allowed people to survive was its polar opposite, desperate mutualism. Your survival depended entirely on your neighbor, and their survival depended on you. And nothing illustrates this more perfectly than a barn raising. Imagine your neighbor's barn, the structure that holds his precious livestock and the harvest that is his only food for the winter, burns to the ground. It's a catastrophe that could mean ruin and starvation. But the word goes out. And on the appointed day, you see them coming. Wagons appear from over the horizon, converging on the blackened patch of ground. It's every family from a 20-mile radius. Your social calendar might be empty for 360 days a year, but a barn raising is like the Super Bowl, the Oscars, and a giant family reunion all rolled into one. The men set to work. There is a cheerful chaos of shouting, sawing, and hammering. Men who spend most of their lives in near total isolation now work together, their individual skills combining into a powerful, collective force. They heave the massive, hand-hewn timber frames into place, walking them upright with long poles in a display of coordinated strength. Meanwhile, the women orchestrate a different kind of miracle. They have pooled their precious resources, contributing chickens, sacks of potatoes, jars of preserves, and bags of flour. They work around massive outdoor fires, preparing a feast on a scale you haven't seen since the last gathering. After months of eating beans and bacon, the sight of a table groaning with roasted meat, fresh bread, and multiple kinds of pie is enough to make a grown man weep. The children, for once, are free from their endless chores. They run wild in shrieking packs, playing games, exploring the creek, and getting reacquainted with kids they may not have seen for months. By late afternoon, where there was only ash that morning, a brand new barn stands, smelling of fresh-cut pine. The work is done, but the day is not over. Someone pulls out a fiddle. The dust is swept from the new floorboards, and the dancing begins. In the warm glow of lanterns, the community celebrates its own resilience. For one day, the loneliness is banished. The hardship is forgotten. And you go home with a full belly and a full heart, knowing that should disaster strike you, this same community will be there to raise you up. The church was another vital hub of community life. In many new settlements, the first public building they erected was a simple, one-room church, which often doubled as the schoolhouse. People would travel for hours, dressed in their finest, most mended clothes, just to attend the Sunday service. But it was about so much more than religion. It was about connection. It was the town's weekly news service, its social club, and its support network. After the sermon, people would linger for hours, sharing news, trading gossip, arranging help for a sick neighbor, and letting their children play. The church picnic was a sacred institution, a potluck feast that reaffirmed the bonds of community. These gatherings were the oases in the desert of hardship. A wedding was a cause for a multi-day celebration, a powerful symbol of hope and continuity. Holidays like the 4th of July or Christmas were seized upon as excuses for a party, a chance to break the monotony with games, music, and special food. And in a world with almost no formal entertainment, people made their own. In many communities, the literary society or the public debate was a popular event. Adults would gather to read aloud from newspapers or books, to recite poetry, or to engage in formal debates on topics both serious and silly. The spelling bee wasn't just for children. It was a cutthroat intellectual sport for the whole town. These moments of joy weren't a luxury. They were a psychological necessity. They were the threads that wove isolated, vulnerable families into a tough, resilient social fabric. The myth of the rugged individualist is a powerful one, but it's a story best enjoyed from the comfort of a sofa. The people who actually lived the life knew the truth. You couldn't survive the West alone. The real, unspoken motto of the frontier wasn't, "Do it yourself." It was, "Help is on the way." And so, people found ways to endure. They built communities out of loneliness, and they created moments of joy in a landscape of hardship. They raised barns and they raised families. They fell in love, they danced, they sang, and they persevered. That resilience is a crucial part of the story, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. But after this long journey through the past, peeling back the layers of myth and memory, we have to come back to that first, challenging question. Think you're tough enough for the Wild West? Think again. Hollywood gave you the heroic gunslinger in a clean duster, facing down evil with a steely gaze. The reality was an exhausted, underpaid teenager on a cattle drive, covered in filth, whose greatest fear wasn't an outlaw, but a lightning storm that could stampede the herd and crush him in an instant. Hollywood gave you the noble sheriff, the man who tamed a lawless town. The reality was a poorly paid marshal whose main job was chasing pigs out of the general store. Or worse, the brutal reality of a lynch mob, where the only law was the fury of the crowd and the strength of a rope. The myth promised a land of equal opportunity, a clean slate where any man could make his fortune. The reality was a brutal racial hierarchy, where Chinese laborers were massacred and then excluded by law, where Mexican families were stripped of their ancestral lands, and where the dream of freedom for black settlers was constantly shadowed by the specter of prejudice. The myth gave you the romantic adventure of the wagon train, a jaunty journey to a promised land. The reality was a 2,000-mile-long graveyard, a death march where 1 in 10 people died from cholera, dysentery, and horrific accidents, their bodies left in unmarked graves on the vast, indifferent prairie. You were sold the dream of the independent homesteader, the master of his own destiny. The truth was a desperate farmer in a leaky sod house, fighting drought and locusts, only to be trapped in a hopeless cycle of debt to the railroad monopolies that controlled his fate from 1,000 miles away. You were told stories of the glamorous gold rush. The truth was the life of a miner, breathing pulverized rock in a dark, suffocating tunnel, knowing he was far more likely to die from a cave-in or a diseased lung than he ever was to strike it rich. Even the land itself was a lie. The iconic tumbleweed, that perfect symbol of the authentic, windswept West, is actually an invasive species. It's the Russian thistle, an immigrant that arrived in the 1870s, a foreign transplant that took over the landscape, just like the settlers themselves. The ultimate debate among historians is whether the story of the West should be framed as one of triumphant settlement or one of brutal conquest. The truth is, it must be seen as both. The West was a place of incredible courage and profound cruelty, of inspiring resilience and unforgivable injustice. It was the stage for the best and the worst of human nature. The heroic myth is a simple, comfortable story. The real history is a messy, complicated, and often painful one. But it's in that complexity that a deeper truth resides, a truth about the cost of a dream and the ghosts that history leaves behind. But our journey tonight is over. The dust of the trail has settled, and the noise of the boomtown has faded into the past. Let the hard edges of that reality soften now, and the heavy weight of it all begin to lift from your shoulders. The flickering candle in the sod house has burned down, and the last embers of the lonely campfire have turned to gray ash. There is only the deep, profound silence of the prairie at night, and the immense, star-dusted sky stretching out into infinity. The wind, which has been your constant companion on this long journey, finally quiets to a gentle whisper through the tall grass. All the struggle and the striving, the hope and the heartbreak, have been absorbed back into the vast, sleeping land. There is nothing left for you to do now but rest. Let the darkness be a soft, warm blanket. Let the silence be a peaceful comfort. Let your mind drift away from the past and into the quiet, welcome stillness of your own deep and gentle sleep.